So welcome everyone to today's session, hosted by Sylvie from MyHR. So today's topic is all about remuneration and pay increases. And so Sylvie is the lead HR consultant, which we're really excited to have Sylvie with us from MyHR. So she has worked with businesses across the spectrum, from startups to corporates, and brings a wealth of practice, wealth of practical people and process experience with her to us today. So without further ado, and less chat from me, I'll hand over to Sylvie. And if you've got any questions, do you want people to ask them as you go, Sylvie, or towards the end?
They're more than welcome to ask them as we go. Depending on what comes up, I might answer them in the flow of our discussion today, or I might hold them to the end, but feel free to put them through as they come to mind. No dramas.
Cool. I'll hand over to you.
Nice one. Thank you, Kelly. Well, kia ora koutou, lovely to see you on what is becoming a scorching hot South Island day. I'm normally based in Auckland, but I have the privilege of coming down to Queenstown for a couple of days this week to present at another conference and do some work with a couple of clients down here. So thank you for hosting me. Everyone's been lovely so far. You have certainly put the word out. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion today about remuneration and pay, especially given the end of the financial year is coming up. It's a very timely conversation for us to be having. So thank you to Kelly and the Chamber of Commerce for hosting us. So let me just share my screen quickly, and then we will go through and just cover off a couple of house rules before we get started. Cool. So the session today is being recorded, so if you do have to duck out for whatever reason, or if your internet kind of slows down and you need to check back in later, you're super welcome to. This does mean, of course, that if you are asking questions and I'm answering them, that will be recorded. So don't share any information that is identifying or anything you'd want to be kept confidential. I'll do my best to scrub anything out as we go through, but just be mindful that this will be recorded and available later. All questions are good questions. Please come at me with them. I promise it's unlikely I won't have heard it before. And pay can be a really fraught topic for us as employees and also for us as managers of teams. So it's a totally safe space. If there is anything that you want to dive into or anything you want to challenge that I'll talk about today, I really welcome all of those questions and all of that feedback. If you've attended webinars and online sessions before, you'll know that as much as I can be gesturing and talking away, these sessions really come alive when there's a lot of audience participation. So again, would really encourage you to put your comments and your questions out there. So in terms of what we'll cover off today, the first thing we'll do is talk a little bit about why it is that we want to get remuneration right. We'll look at the legalities, what the guardrails are that we have to operate within when we're talking about pay with our teams and making decisions about pay. We'll look at pay parity and the different things that we might be considering when we talk about pay parity, because there's a few ways to think about it. We'll quickly cover off kind of a really succinct summary of what your different strategies might be when it comes to pay. We'll spend a bit more time around managing pay conversations and thinking about how to approach those with your team. And then we'll talk a little bit about what are the other levers you can pull if remuneration and pay isn't something that you can put a lot of money into or a lot of time into. Heaps of time for questions at the end. I'll aim to be about 30 minutes, which will take us to 2:35. And then questions, discussions, we can get into it after that. So let's start off by talking about getting remuneration right and why we care about it. The main reason it's important is that pay is what we think of as a hygiene factor. So if it's not good enough, by whatever that definition might be, people tend to get pretty pissed off. If you think you're being underpaid or not paid fairly, you get pretty grumpy about that pretty quickly. On the other hand, we know from decades and decades of research that paying people really well, like swinging the pendulum in the other direction, actually doesn't result in a proportionate increase in good feelings. It just kind of brings you up to level. So it's a hygiene factor because if it's not there, it's grubby. It makes people really unhappy. But if you are being paid fairly, you don't feel super duper stoked and amazing. You just feel like, yeah, this is kind of a level playing field and this is where we should be. So if we get it wrong, it causes us a lot of problems, but getting it right just means we're avoiding problems, not that we're signing up for a bunch of good stuff. And that's a subtle distinction to make, but explains why when we talk about motivating our employees and rewarding them, we don't just talk about money, we talk about all of the other things that surround it as well. And we'll touch on that a bit later in the session. We know that if you pay poorly compared to other employers, you'll lose staff, which is enormously costly. And the research kind of varies in terms of impact, but anything from 30% to 100% of someone's salary is what you can expect to have to bear the cost of if you need to replace them. So if you're replacing someone who's on, 50 grand a year, you're looking at between sort of 15 grand and 50 grand's worth of cost just to replace them in your business because of the institutional knowledge loss, the time it takes to find someone to replace them, and the cost of training and so on. If you are looking to replace someone or even to hire new, if you're not paying market rates, you better have a really compelling employee value proposition to compete with businesses and organizations who can afford to pay market rates. Again, more on an EVP later. And it's just a reputational issue. If people know that you don't pay that well, or if they know that you're not considered to be competitive, it can cause other kinds of problems too. It might make it harder for you to do business or harder for you to get things done in other spheres. So immediately, you don't want your team to be pissed off. You want to be able to recruit people in your organization, and you want to be able to replace them when you need to. So getting remuneration right is a really important question, a really important problem for us to be trying to solve. So when we're talking about pay, we're not just talking about a completely open-ended space where we can pay whatever rates we want. It's not the Wild West out there. We do have legal minimums in place. So in New Zealand, we have the minimum wage, which is going up on the 1st of April. The adult minimum wage then also has training rates and a youth rate as well, depending on the circumstances of that employment. So that changes usually on a yearly basis. If you're on a collective agreement, obviously there will be minimums set in there for you and your people, and KiwiSaver is something that employers must account for and must pay. So there's a floor that we can't go below. There is a benefit that we can't contract out of. And then beyond that, we can do more or less. We're a lot more freedom, but we can't pay below the minimum wage, and we can't not pay KiwiSaver or not account for KiwiSaver when we're paying our employees. There's a couple of slightly archaic or slightly weird requirements that are built into New Zealand law, and they come from a time before we kind of had computers and bank transfers. But basically the law says that by default, you must pay your employees in cash and not in, buttons or hugs or trade goods or chips from the corner store down the road. You have to pay them in cash unless your employment agreement says otherwise. So in ye olden days, that would have been by check, but certainly now that we have electronic payments, most employment agreements that I've ever seen will say that payment of wages or salaries will be made by a transfer into a nominated bank account. So that's fine, but if you don't say that, you have to pay them in cash, which is wild and would be really unwieldy for most of us. We also know that the law says you can't control what employees spend their money on. So this is mostly to protect people who for example, work in retail, and their employer might try to make them buy clothing from the retail store to rep the brands or to rep the look of the company. You actually can't do that. That's illegal. You can certainly provide options for them to purchase clothing more cheaply, for example, but employees cannot be dictated to by their employer in terms of how they spend their money. And also when there are additional payments like commissions and bonuses, there are often pieces in the Holidays Act in particular that will be triggered by the payment of commissions and bonuses. So if you do have people who are getting paid more than just an hourly rate or a salary, have a look at your pay setup and make sure that you're getting that right and not falling afoul of the Holidays Act, which is a notoriously treacherous piece of legislation, and is worth the time to make sure that you're doing what it tells you to do. Of course, there are laws against discriminating discriminating against people with regards to pay based on kind of protected categories. So it's things like gender, religion, ethnicity or nationality, whether they're married or not, whether they're pregnant or not. All of those categories are people against whom you cannot discriminate or pay differently because of their ethnicity, their gender, their pregnancy status, and so on. I don't often have to really hammer that home for people, but it is worth noting that there are laws that protect against that. It's not just something we do because we think it's morally right. And if there is anything in your organization or any pay dynamics that maybe get raised as a result of this webinar that you want to interrogate a little bit, I'm always happy to have a conversation confidentially just to give you a bit of a steer. So if anything comes up that is maybe triggering some faint alarm bells, you're always welcome to get in touch. Now, the reason we want to get all of this right is that getting it wrong has consequences for us as employers. So we know that there can be legal action taken against us if you are failing to pay your employees correctly, even if it's a genuine accident, or if your accountant was rubbish, or if your payroll provider was getting it wrong. You have to go back 7 years through all of your pay records and then correctly pay everyone who you paid incorrectly over that time. So 7 years of a cock up is a lot of money often, and is a lot of cash to have to pay. So we want to get it right the first time so we don't have that liability. But also, if we're doing it maliciously, which I'm sure no one on this call would ever engage in doing, there are much more serious claims for discrimination, which can go either through the Human Rights Tribunal for like massive 6-figure payouts, or more commonly, if they go through the Employment Relations Authority, they tend to result in kind of 5-figure payments for disadvantage or breach of good faith, or other kind of discriminatory claims. Again, there's a reputational component here that we want to be mindful of. If there is if word gets out that you're underpaying people, or you only have to think about the Nova Pay debacle with the Ministry for Education and paying teachers a few years back. It can be pretty devastating when you get pay wrong. Again, if we get it wrong, people get really, really angry. If we get it right, we just avoid the angry stuff. So we definitely want to get it right, because having a bunch of people feeling like you are not doing fairly by them can cause lots of problems later down the line, the first of which would be legal consequences. So when we start talking about payment and paying our people, again, that discrimination piece doesn't often come up. Very rarely comes up, I should be clear. The first thing I get asked a lot of the time is, what's the market paying? Kind of what are other people doing? So how do I know as an employer that I'm paying my team right? And there's a few different ways that we can talk about parity, but asking what the market is paying is one way of making sure that we are paying fairly based on what else is happening in our industry with similar jobs, or within our organization, depending on how we slice it. So we'll talk about market parity, then we'll talk about a couple of internal ways to think about parity too. I won't spend too long here, but if you do have extra questions that you want to get into, again, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, or we can always have a conversation later if that would be more appropriate. So market parity is looking at, are people in my business or my organization paid fairly compared to what they would earn if they went to another employer? So if I have a sales manager, am I paying her fairly compared to what she could earn as a sales manager for a competitor or someone else in the industry? Across multiple employers, I guess, is what's key here. This is quite tricky to assess, because pay information obviously is quite confidential. People don't tend to share information. In New Zealand, we're notoriously uncomfortable with discussions around pay, and even privately, it's still not that common for people to talk about salaries. And certainly organisations who aren't larger corporations with really clear pay banding, or public sector organisations with banding that they can share, usually don't share this kind of information. So finding it out is quite hard to tell. There is some publicly available pay data. Those larger organisations I mentioned tend to publish pay bands. On Seek, which is that job posting board I'm sure all of you have used before, they require a salary to be listed, and filtering you can access that information. I think it's the Stats Office puts out kind of median pay rates across countries and the country in different regions every year, but it is hard to figure out what is being paid in the market, which is where salary surveys like the Hayes survey that comes out every year can be really helpful, because getting access to this information is challenging kind of on a one-off basis. So something to flag, we know that fair pay agreement legislation has been passed, and the bus drivers and one other group who I can't remember right now have put through an application for a fair pay agreement to be negotiated. This is going to be a really new dynamic for New Zealand when it comes into play, because it's going to set a bar for all employers in a particular industry or in a particular service, and set rates that they have to pay. So market parity in some contexts, as we go through the implementation of fair pay agreements, is going to be set for us. It's very similar to the Australian award system, so we can look at their labour market and see what's happened over there. But just a heads up to keep an eye on this legislation, and certainly MyHR's working closely with our clients who are likely to be affected to start understanding what the ramifications might be and to start conversations about how they might want to engage in those negotiations or be represented in them. If you are a MyHR client, separate to any of the fair pay stuff, because we have a database of 25,000 plus active employees across all industries across New Zealand and Australia, we provide market remuneration reviews for our clients, which means that we will go in and go, awesome. So you want to know what a barista gets paid? We'll pull all of the barista pay rates that we have. We can slice and dice them based on size of cafe or size of restaurant or where they are in the country, and give you kind of to the minute up-to-date pay information to help inform decisions about pay in your organisation. If this is something you're keen to understand more, get in touch. We're at help@myhr.works. Even if you aren't a client but are considering maybe getting some support in this space, let us know, because we're keen to know how we can be helpful, and we can maybe show you some of the ways that we could be supportive. So jumping on to internal pay parity then, this is about looking within your organisation to see if people in different roles, teams and levels of seniority are being paid fairly when compared to each other. So some of the questions that we would start off by asking would be, this person over here who's earning 100 grand, are they adding twice as much value as the person being paid 50 grand? And if they aren't adding twice as much value, why then is their pay twice as high as this person? Obviously, there's usually a more nuanced answer to that, but it can be a good place to start. We also might look and see if your pay scales make sense. So if when you graduate from, for example, a junior engineer to an intermediate engineer and you get a 30K pay bump, why then do your intermediate to senior engineers only get a 5K pay bump? Is that scaling useful? Is it meaningful to you and your team when you're trying to motivate and reward and retain your staff? The last piece that we start to talk around here is, would you be happy for either your pay rates or your kind of internal measures to be made public? So there isn't a requirement in New Zealand for this to happen, but organisations over the size of 100 employees now in Australia must publish their pay information, not as in Sylvie earns $30 an hour, like it's not that granular, but in terms of assessing pay gaps and kind of gender equity questions in the UK, Germany, Canada, Iceland, and now Australia, there is legislation required that requires businesses to publish that information. There is a campaign in New Zealand called Mind the Gap, an organisation who's pushing for this to be made public, and organisations are signing up. But just a heads up that over the long term, we may see a direction towards more sharing of this kind of information rather than less sharing. Cool. The last piece around parity we'll speak to is thinking about like-for-like parity. So we've talked about what's happening in the market. We've talked about what's happening within the organisation, comparing different roles. We're now going to talk about comparing people in identical or similar roles, kind of doing mostly the same work. Yes, you can take into account experience and performance when paying people differently in these roles. You cannot take into account gender, what their religion is, what their union status membership is like, and so on. So if you have a really experienced graphic designer and a newer graphic designer, you can totally pay them differently depending on their experience level. But you have to be quite clear that you can justify it based on those grounds, rather than something that might cause you some legal trouble, like any of those protected categories that we talked about earlier. The risks here is that if there are people in same or similar roles who are paid differently, is you run the risk of a legal claim for discrimination. The law that governs discriminatory pay claims here is the Equal Pay Act from 1972, which sets out the legal principle that people must be paid the same rate if they do the same work. And also that the Equal Pay Amendment Act, which came into force in 2020, provided a mechanism for broad-based kind of occupational level claims for discrimination based on pay. So the early childhood educators was the first case that kind of pushed that through a few years back, and for carers as well. So we know that people are willing to use these laws, and we just need to be careful that we can demonstrate and justify why and or how our pay rates are different, and make sure that that's connected to performance or experience or skill. So jumping through into different remuneration strategies, I often find that clients assume, or businesses and organizations assume, that they should be competitive, that they should be trying to match the market rate. And sometimes you can get, you open up the field, I guess, for being a bit more strategic or a bit more tactical about your pay if you think beyond trying to match the market, and that can go in two directions. So the first of that is you can choose to pay low rates. And despite what I said earlier around, wanting to be a fair payer, if you can, choosing to pay low rates may be a good strategic choice. The pros, obviously, it keeps your wages bill down. It has less impact on cash flow. You carry less liability in terms of annual leave and sick leave and so on, because the value of those hours and that time is less. This isn't a bad choice. This can be perfectly legitimate for you if it's appropriate for your industry. In Auckland, I don't know what it's like down here, but the big four kind of accounting and consulting firms, so KPMG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, and the one that I always forget, the other one, PwC is the fourth, are notorious for paying the kind of entry-level roles quite low rates compared to the industry, and billing them out at massively inflated rates to clients, knowing that they will churn through a bunch of their graduates and their new folk. But that's acceptable to them because their work is they can train people, bring them in, bring them up. And as you go through the industry, your pay increases. But they start out by paying quite low rates, and that's a choice that they're making. So if you do choose to go with this strategy, you will need to accept that there will be some trade-offs. So high churn and or employee unhappiness is going to be more prevalent, again, because your rates are lower. And you'll have to compensate in other ways that are going to require resources or thinking kind of beyond pay. So if you have an amazing culture or amazing projects, people may be willing to take a pay cut to come and work with you with your amazing vibe and the awesome work that you have. If you're a charity or a not-for-profit, we know that sunshine wages are a thing. You're kind of earning less because you're working in a sector where you have a passion or a real commitment to the cause. If it's a glamorous industry like journalism or the arts or anything kind of fun and funky, travel would be a good one. Again, tend to have kind of lower rates. And can you offer sweat equity? So if you're a startup or if you're early in your life as a business, can you offer equity and shares to your employees to compensate for the fact that maybe you don't have the cash just yet or the reserves to pay them rates that would be more in line with what the market's paying? So the middle of the road REM strategy, of course, is to pay market rates. So the reason you would want to do this is it takes pay out of the equation when you're competing with employees for other companies. It doesn't unnecessarily inflate your wages bill. It's kind of it's a very common and can be a very strategic choice to take. So it kind of means that pay no longer becomes a unique selling point or a point of difference between yourself and a different organization or a different employer who might be competing for the same talent. So you can think of it as kind of your table stakes in that regard. The cons of that, you're vulnerable to your employees being unhappy or leaving for other reasons, which might not be as visible or as easy to solve as pay. And you will have to distinguish your company or your organization for other reasons when you're hiring. So coming back to that previous slide, you'll still need to have to talk about the culture that you have or the amazing projects you work on or the fabulous development and progression opportunities you have, because you can't distinguish yourself on pay. It's just less pressing for you than it is for the lower wages folk, because they have to like compensate and get up to kind of a level footing because they start below, because they're paying the people below market rates. Then the other strategy that's much more commonly talked about is paying above market rates. So if you can afford to, and you can choose to pay your talent, all of the cash monies, people who care about money will come and work for you. It will be easier to find talent in certain industries. and it will be obviously easier to compete with other companies on pay alone. So you're unlikely to be losing out talent because they can get better pay elsewhere if they can't. That's especially tactical or important in an environment like the one we are in now, where there is a cost of living crisis. People's wages are hurting, people's wallets are hurting, inflation's on the rise. We know that people are finding it pretty tough to do the do right now. And so if you are choosing to pay above market rates, especially now, that is going to be quite compelling to people who maybe in previous years had enough of a buffer in their personal finances not to have to kind of chase the money and not to have to worry about getting paid above market. Some of the cons, of course, is that it is expensive. You are going to have to spend more of your budget on keeping your people paid. And it may also keep your turnover artificially low. If you think about paying above market rates as being a form of kind of golden handcuffs, it's really hard to take a pay cut to go elsewhere when you've gotten used to a 10 to 15% cushier lifestyle than you might otherwise have. And that can be detrimental because people who kind of are a bit rubbished and you might hope that they would eventually just move on through natural attrition are potentially more likely to stay. And you also won't have new folk coming into your organization who maybe have fresh ideas or different ways of doing things or are more hooked into the latest technology and the latest trends. So there are some cons with choosing to pay above market, which doesn't always get talked about. So moving into, I think, what I'm hoping will be the meat of our conversation discussion today is around managing pay conversations with employees. There's a lot to get right here. And again, because people's feelings and kind of connection to pay and our sort of social expectations that pay is a marker of value mean that people can run a bit hot under the collar around this kind of stuff. So it's important to get right because pay matters for all the reasons we've talked about earlier, but also it's important to get pay right because people will have kind of not overblown reactions, but more heightened reactions to this kind of stuff than they might otherwise. So the first rule of managing pay discussions is defining success, setting expectations, and making sure you prevent surprises. Any pay conversation where there is a surprise, except when that surprise is, I'm giving you $5,000 extra because you're awesome, way to go you, can go really badly wrong. And most of your work when managing expectations around pay actually happens in the year preceding the pay conversation. If you are having regular performance check-ins with your team in whatever format kind of that makes sense, if you are setting clear goals, communicating what they need to succeed, steering them back on course if they ever are underperforming or need some guidance, when you then come to sit down and go, okay, let's talk about your pay, they have had a year of you being pretty clear about whether they are or aren't succeeding. And so it's unlikely they will be surprised if they don't get the increase they wanted or if it's lower than they expected because you've been managing that expectation. Of course, performance and conduct are just one of the things we think about when talking about pay. Obviously, you want to be really transparent through the year about how the organization is doing. Like, did you lose a big account that you need to make people aware of so they don't expect as big a handout come kind of annual review time? Do you need to be clear that you're investing a lot of money in R&D at the moment, so you're choosing to reinvest profits in the business rather than kind of increase pay across the board? Whatever is happening, make sure your people are tuned into it, because setting that context means that when you make decisions based on that context later down the line, you've done the work of bringing your people along on the journey, and you've conditioning sounds manipulative, and I don't mean it that way, but you've conditioned them to understand what is happening in the broader context. So when it comes down to talking about their pay and what they might be asking for, you're not having to tell that whole story of the past year or the past 6 months kind of in one discussion. So having done all of the support work to manage performance and expectations and keep your team informed and bring them along with whatever is happening in your world that might affect pay, you need to be prepared for a pay discussion and be prepared to support that decision with data. So make sure you understand the work that your person is doing. Obviously start with the job description, but it's very, very natural and very common for roles to evolve over time and for things to change. So if your person is doing work that was not what they were doing a year ago, or if their job description has evolved over time, make sure you understand the impact of that on their remuneration and how you might want to talk about that and how you might want to fit that into your discussion. Certainly look at their skill set and growth potential. Are they someone who is, for example, really enthusiastic and keen to learn and has the right attitude, but is still kind of building their skill set and building their effectiveness in the role? You might want to consider giving them a slightly higher than otherwise pay increase to show them that you see that they are working to improve and they're doing all the right things. It's just a function of time as they improve their skill set. On the other hand, if you've got someone who's a solid, steady performer, no issues, but they're a bit surly, or they're not really getting along with the team, or they're a bit of a roadblock, or their behavior kind of isn't quite where you want it to be, sure, they're a solid performer and maybe doing better than the person who's an enthusiastic newcomer, but do you want to be rewarding the behavior that you're seeing? Because that's also part of the message that you send when considering, when giving increases and considering pay. So whichever way you go and whatever factors you consider, make sure you explain how the decision was made and be really transparent as far as you can about what factors went into the decision and how you arrived at these numbers. Share your company financial performance. Show them the research that you did with a pay consultant or looking at any of the salaries to get to these numbers. Basically, make sure that you can talk about it. And one of the things that I think businesses and organizations tend to be pretty familiar with is looking at the market and looking at comparable roles and seeing if the value of that work has changed in the last 12 months. We understand that we run the risk of losing our people to other job offers. So I think our literacy or familiarity with using the market to check rates is pretty good. But do remember just to have a look and see if there have been significant movements, because that is likely to affect the discussion that you have as well. I alluded to this just before, but we recommend distinguishing between pay discussions as kind of a thing that happens here and performance reviews. The reason being is that performance is one of the factors that gets considered when talking about pay, but it's not the only one. Broader economic context, success or struggles of the organization, parity with it, like there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into determining what one person should be paid. And so having a performance discussion needs to be about, did you meet the objectives we set out, and did we support you with development to work on your skills to get there? And then the pay piece is separate and it's connected to this, but they are not the same. Try and separate those conversations out, because otherwise your high performers will always expect lots and lots of cash because they've only ever been given this performance review kind of support. They haven't been given the context around all of the other things that might be happening in an organization which affects your pay discussions. Make sure you check for bias in your decision making. So unconscious bias is a thing. Humans are biased. It's a feature, not a bug of the way that our brains are wired. But we need to have systems in place to make sure that when we are making discussions around pay, especially given the kind of moral impacts of paying people unfairly and the legal risk of doing so, make sure that we do just have some checks in place to check that we're being fair and connected to objective decision making for this, rather than going with a gut or going with the first thing that comes to mind, because that can lead us down the garden path essentially. Beyond pay, remember to show or talk about the things that you do as an organization to show that you value your employees beyond cash. So do you have really flexible working conditions? Do you have really flexible remote working policies? Are there amazing projects that you have put this person on to stretch and develop them? Be really clear that pay is a component of how we reward and motivate and connect with our staff and show that we value them, but it's not the only one. And sometimes this involves thinking outside the box, right? So people are motivated by different things. And so getting a bit fluent in and connected to what it is that motivates our team means that we can be a bit more creative and a bit more tactical when we are thinking about how to show them that we reward them. This is especially true and useful when we can't compete on pay for whatever reason. If we're in the not-for-profit space, if we don't have the cash reserves to deliver these pay increases, if there have been some economic headwinds we've been battling against, all that kind of stuff makes the need to be creative and quite tailored with our approach much more pertinent. So the other question I get asked second to what is the market paying is, what if my person's unhappy with the pay increase that I give them? And this can be really gutting, especially when, and I've had experiences like this as a manager where I've been stoked to give someone a pay rise of X%, and they were really disappointed because they were expecting a greater increase. And sometimes maybe I could have been more generous, or I could have gotten them a bigger number, and sometimes they needed to be a bit more realistic about their expectations. But it leaves a really sour taste in your mouth when you as a manager are going, ta-da, here's an increase, and their reaction is disappointment rather than like recognition that you've kind of made something cool happen for them. So the best thing to do here is to set out a plan for that employee to get to the next pay increase. Whether that's a 3-month plan or a 12-month plan, it doesn't really matter, as long as you can say, here are the factors that you can control, Sylvie, around your pay. I want to see you improving the quality of the briefings that you're giving to your colleagues, because I know that can be a frustration sometimes. I want to see you recovering more of your billable hours because you're a consultant, that's how we make money. I want to see you doing more sales work to drive, whatever it is. Let's lay out a path for things that you can control, and if you can meet those expectations or tick those milestones off, then we will have a conversation about pay, and you can even put a number on it if it's helpful. But put a plan in place would be my first recommendation. The second thing, and this tends to come in more useful when your employees are unrealistic. I've certainly had conversations with team members where they usually are younger, but they have a sometimes wildly inflated sense of how quickly pay moves. And there's no reason you can't say to them, well, look, we clearly have different expectations here. I think that a 4% increase is reasonable, and you're asking for a 10% increase. There's quite a lot of daylight between those two positions. So can you go and do some research? And if you can come back with something that's compelling or the information I don't have, we'll revisit it. But go and see if you could get a 10% pay increase elsewhere. I'm not firing you or telling you I don't want you to be here, but I think you need to test your expectations against what you can find in the market, because based on what I'm seeing, and I'm being transparent about what that is, I just think a 10% increase is unrealistic. So there's no reason you can't push your employees respectfully and not in a, suck it up, go find a better job kind of way, to go in and test their value and see what else they can find. Again, this piece around reinforcing the overall package. If someone's a little bit disappointed with pay, but you're a startup and that's kind of how it's going to go for the next 3 to 5 years, focus on the fact that they're in an environment where they can get their hands in lots of different projects, for example, or an environment where they're working with the founder or co-founders of the organization and getting an insight into how to run and start a business. Whatever the pros are, whatever else is going on that you have, make sure to talk about that as being a benefit's too strong a word, but it adds to the flavor of why you'd choose to work somewhere, and pay is one of the reasons, but for most people it's not the only reason. As an HR person, I end up tidying up the messes of these conversations sometimes. So I'm giving you a powerful tool here, and please don't misuse it, but don't be afraid to have a frank conversation with the employee. So if they're unhappy because they're a bit rubbish and they think they're amazing and we're expecting a different result, figure out how to respectfully and carefully tell them they're a bit rubbish, which is why they didn't get a pay increase. Or if they are being entitled or behaving in an entitled way around pay, you can give them that feedback. Again, as you're not saying it's, you're an uppity woman and women should be grateful for what they get because it wasn't that long ago you didn't have the right to vote. Obviously don't do that. But where it's just around managing expectations or around their performance or behavior not meeting the mark, just lay it out, be really direct with them. People tend to respond much better than we expect them to when we are transparent and clear and obvious and can explain why decisions are made and what needs to happen from here. If your employees more broadly, though, are unhappy with pay, it might be worth figuring out why they choose to stay. Like if there's griping and whinging about pay all the time, but you've got a bunch of folk who've been around for like 7 or 8 years, clearly something is going right. And this can be a helpful tool when you want to understand why it is that they're staying, so that you can talk about it to them and remind them of all the reasons why they're here. So unlike an exit interview, a stay interview is basically, why do you work here? What do you like or dislike about your work? What are the things that we do awesomely? What are the things that we could do a better job of? How do our pay and benefits compare to your last job, for example? You can basically put whatever into it you want to know. And it's different to an engagement survey in that it's specifically focused around why do you choose to work here and not somewhere else? So it has a blunter, kind of narrower focus than engagement surveys tend to. So again, a useful tool if you need some help figuring out how to talk about why people would want to work here. This piece around employee value proposition ties into that last piece around why would people choose to work for you if pay isn't the driving reason. And the reason I have it here is I really just want to name a couple of the factors or dimensions that people tend to consider. So we know that people choose to work places and choose to stay there based on pay. So that is a factor. Beyond that, it's about meaning, so about the impact they can have. It's about work-life balance, about the team and culture they can work with, around the development and career opportunities, and then around like the actual content and work, like the tasks that they do. I'm sure there are many more things I could add to the list, but broadly, if you have a job where you are doing something you care about, in my case, I really enjoy and get a lot of satisfaction out of helping small and medium businesses figure out people problems. I just love that kind of work. Work-life balance. I mean, I'm in Queenstown on what is becoming a very hot day. Like that's a pretty cool experience. If you can kind of tick off a few of those other categories, pay becomes less compelling. And so if your organization does do some of this really well, but maybe you don't talk about it because it kind of just feels like the way we do things, and we do all get used to that kind of stuff. Start thinking about and start talking about it as part of your employee value proposition or your EVP, which is why someone would choose to work here, what value they get out of it as an employee, and pay is one of those factors, but not the only one. So I think I'm about 8 minutes over. Sorry, everyone. It was me getting a bit carried away. But that was all the content that I wanted to cover off in terms of talking about pay when we think about why it's important, the legal guardrails we want to manage ourselves to, when we're talking about parity, what is it that we mean, and then how are we managing those conversations and what should we be thinking about. So thank you for bearing with. I hope some of that content was helpful. I would love to jump into some questions. Is anything I've said that you disagree with and would push back on strongly? Has any of this worked for you? Have you tried it? Do you have any questions around managing this kind of stuff? Please jump in and I'll start answering. I can see I've got one question come through. A question from Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. Can businesses have a pay freeze for all employees, and how long should this last if they do? Oh, that's a great question. So it is legal to have a pay freeze. That's totally legal. The exceptions would be if you had something like a collective employment agreement where there were regular pay increases required based on like increasing your qualification level or increasing your skill list, your skills. Or if in an individual employment agreement, you committed to a pay increase for whatever reason that you chose to do that. So unless you aren't contracted to offer a pay increase, and most of the time you won't be, you can totally have a pay freeze for all employees. Absolutely. In terms of the how long should this last piece, that is totally a how long is a piece of string question, because what you are likely to be considering will be like probably the financial health of the business. Either you have slid backwards, or you're downsizing, or something else is happening that's creating financial risk that you aren't comfortable managing, or not comfortable, but like that is causing problems. And so therefore saying to everyone, we're not going to look at increasing pay is one way of reducing the pressure on your finances because you're not increasing your wage bill. People will eventually leave, especially if you have people who are upskilling and developing their skill set and expecting to be paid more as their value increases. So you run the risk of kind of just attrition over time. So how long it should be, I kind of think anything longer than like 1 or 2 years, particularly in this environment where inflation we know is driving costs up and it just isn't practical for people to continue swallowing their pay being the same over a period of time. I think a pay freeze for 1 cycle, I think you could probably argue for, like, and not be being unreasonable. I think anything longer than a year or 2, you'll get the risks of that causing more problems than it solves, for me, would be something I would be keeping quite a close eye on. So thank you for your question, Kelly. That's a really good one. Andy says, hey Andy, thanks for joining us. How do you deal with the recent rise in cost of living and inflation? A lot of employees expect this. I think it's currently around 7 to 8%. Excellent question. It's one that I'm dealing with a lot at the moment. So larger organizations tend to offer pay increases, which are tied to the consumer price index, or the CPI, which basically says how much did, across the board, how much did the cost of having a normal life increase over the last year? So it looks at things like groceries, rent, utility service, like professional services, like all of that kind of stuff, and kind of gives you a figure. So some organizations do just offer cost of living increases on an annual basis. And if you have the cash and resources to do that, that's one way to deal with it. For smaller organizations where that just isn't practical, like you can't afford to be increasing your pay 3 to 6% a year indefinitely, some increase is often appreciated. So whether that's going, hey everyone, inflation, and I think you're right, Andy, I think it is about 7% for the last quarter. I can check that, but it's something in and around that number. Saying we can't do 7% pay increases, but we can do 4%, and that gets us some way there. And then it would be about either just going, guys, I'm really sorry, we can't do more than this, and then that just being the end of the discussion. But again, the consequences are that the employees are disappointed. The other thing you can do is look at changes or policies you can bring in that reduce the impact of cost of living. So can you have your team avoid the commute and save on public transport and petrol costs by having them work 2 days a week from home or 3 days a week from home? Do you have business relationships that you could get subsidized access to resources for to help your team? So can you get some really bulk discounts on phone plans, for example, and save people having to pay for their own phones? Any of that kind of stuff around the edges can be helpful. But ultimately, if people are having to pay more to buy groceries and pay their mortgage and pay the electricity bill, ultimately, if you can't keep up with those increases, you're going to see people leave because your rates will fall below kind of what they need to earn a living. So it's a tricky one, and there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. Cool. Anonymous says, we find that we offer a lot of benefits here, but as much as we try to include these into the overall package, our staff seem to think that they are entitled to an above market pay rate, as well as those extras and benefits we offer. Can you suggest a way to lay it out for them to view that value more? Well, that's a great question. I think depending on your organization and who your employees are, whether they're more direct folk or whether they're a bit more indirect, the top end of the full-on nail on the head spectrum would be having a staff or a team discussion about it to go, look, we've been having pay conversations. 70% of you, or whatever the number is, have asked for a pay increase of 10% or more when a cost of living increase would be 7%, and you get all this cool stuff over here. Like, both of these worlds can't be true. We can't be offering all of these amazing pay and benefits as well as offering kind of 10% and above pay increases. That's not sustainable. So either you guys have to adjust your expectations, or we as an organization need to reassess our benefits and reassess how we talk about this kind of stuff. So it would almost be a bit of a project, Anonymous, to understand, like, do your team value all this cool stuff that you offer? And if they don't, can you scrap it and just put that money into pay rates? Like, that would be one way to balance the scales. Or if that's not practicable and you couldn't recoup the cost from cutting benefits that you would need to put into pay rates. About managing expectations, like, have the conversations. If you don't have a remuneration policy, kind of put one in place that you can point back to and go, well, here's how we manage pay and here's what happens. Certainly during recruitment and onboarding, talk about it so people know what to expect. If you have one or two squeaky wheels who are kicking up a fuss and making it sound like a lot of the team are grumpy with this when it might just be one or two people, don't say to your team or your business what you really just need to say to one or two people in private. Like, you might just need to manage those individuals themselves without bringing your whole team into it. So you have some options there. It's a delicate one to manage, but by no means feel that the situation needs to continue where your team are getting what sounds like a pretty kind of cushy, thoughtful benefits package and expecting massive pay increases. It's not, unless you choose the tactic of paying above market rates across the board for benefits and pay. That doesn't sound sensible, and it sounds like you might just need to manage some expectations there, would be the way that I would respond. Cool. Those are all the questions and answers that we have had come through, and we now have 6 minutes before our time is up. Callie, I might just bring you back in and check in to see if you had any questions beyond the one that you submitted or anything else to discuss, while we leave a bit of space for people to come back with anything else. Otherwise we can wrap.
Cool. No, that was really good, really insightful. I've got about a book of notes. One question I did have is, you talked about comparing pay rates across, the market and things like that. How do we compare what we pay in Queenstown to, say, what someone will get in Auckland? And we get a lot of questions about this with regards to, if you're a sales manager here in Queenstown, a lot of the time we're paid less in Queenstown than what they're paid in Auckland. Yet our living costs are pretty much the same, and it's expensive to live in Queenstown. A lot of people say that. So how do we compare that? And is it a fair comparison, or is Queenstown completely underpaying overall compared to Auckland, or how does that sit?
How does that work? Yeah. So my advice is always, where possible, to pay based on region. So with the rise of remote working, someone living in Queenstown could be working for an organization based in Auckland, to use your kind of locations. And so as that happens more and more, this advice becomes less relevant. But there is still a real entrenched view that where your employees are in the same town as you, they are likely to only be looking for work in the same town. So you therefore only have to compare your pay rates against what's happening in the same town. Does that make sense? Because the pool of people you're competing for is in the same place. So I think that approach is a bit sensible. You are only sort of talking about people in the same city. But where we assume that bigger centres are more expensive to live in, and therefore kind of demand higher pay rates, totally doesn't carry for the Queenstown example. Like, it is known that it is very expensive to live here. So I don't know that I can see tools to change that, apart from kind of slow, like, macroeconomic expectations. But my general advice would be, where possible, if you are an employer in Christchurch looking to employ in Christchurch, see if you can drill down to understand what is being paid in your region, because that's going to be the market piece. But that means that certain regions get kind of attached to a bit of a historical ball and chain that maybe no longer fits the current situation. And so you sort of have to look at what your employees are doing. Like, if your people are leaving because you're not paying them, that approach is probably no longer going to serve you. Bit of a hairy problem. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's that was good. That was good, because
I know a lot of businesses will compare from here to Auckland, and they're just not sure. Do we sit somewhere in the middle? Do we keep with comparing just to Queenstown?
Yeah, it's tough. Where possible, try and stick to your region, because that's still most likely who your employees will be comparing pay rates from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But that approach doesn't solve the problem of living costs spiraling out of control and a labour market not keeping up. Yeah. Story of the past 2 years, I think. But I haven't had any other questions come through. So if there's nothing else for our audience, then we can wrap and get back to our afternoons.
Perfect. Sylvie, what was your email address there again? If people have any questions that they want to email you afterwards. There we go. Sylvie@myhr.works is the place to go. Perfect. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, or you want to ask something quite specific to Sylvie, flick her an email. That'd be awesome. And thank you so much, Sylvie. That was really, really insightful, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And you'll see Sylvie again on the 18th of April in person. So Sylvie's joining us for our housing series, which will be then out at Holiday Inn in the Remarkables Park. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the beautiful sunny afternoon. I can feel it back.
Yeah, so I'm steaming up in here. I'm gonna have to go get some fresh air. But thank you. It was lovely to see you, Kelly, and to see everyone else. And looking forward to seeing you in April if we catch up in person.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.